I think we start with some delay. We speak, this part of our day and concluding part of our evening will be in English. I have an introduction, general introduction, which sets a little bit our conversation. And first, I would like to introduce the audience, because to explain who are we. So these are MA and PhD students, but also young researchers holding their degrees in history, and also professors of history, so different ranks, but everybody is involved with the history of Eastern Europe. They take part in a summer program, and the summer program is called Jewish History and Multiethnic Past of Eastern Europe. This is the fifth edition, and while lectures change, the program is never the same. We have different courses, but there is one constant point, repetitive point, which is basic course of Yiddish. And for many participants who are coming from all over Ukraine, this is the first encounter with this language. Some acquire language to pursue further in their academic research and learn and polish it in other places. For others, for some, it's just to get reading ability, to access sources and to enrich their view of past. And for some, like for example me, I took the course last year, it's to have an experience and get in touch with a language which only 3 generations ago was spoken on the streets of this and many other cities in Ukraine and in general Eastern Europe. And it was language of world which was killed. And with millions died in the Second World War and the Holocaust. And for our summer program, we, apart from academic and curriculum and visiting sites, we try to have meetings with people who witnessed the past and have personal attitude to that and personal perspectives of the 20th century. And so these are very special meetings. Last year, we had an honor to talk with 2 Holocaust survivors. We talked with Aaron Weiss from Jerusalem, who survived as a kid in Drohobych, hidden by a Ukrainian woman. A professional historian, he combined in a very unique way perspectives of witness and of researcher. Moreover, he's very engaged in civic projects of historical dialogue and understanding. Janina Heschele survived in Lemberg as a teenager, leaving her account in notes written down right after the war. She was between 12 and 14 years old. And in her account, we have streets, we have Janovska camp, we have betrayals, and an effort of several brave Poles. It was a common effort to save her in the city and get her to Krakow, where she was as the war ended. She was the only who survived from her family, and in 2000 she came back for the first time to this city to show it to her kids and to recall her Lviv. Her father was an editor of a major Jewish newspaper in Polish, and it was encounter with Lemberg, a city occupied between 1941 and 1944 by Nazi Germany, and a place which was a site of murder for almost entire Jewish population. More than 100,000 Jews who lived right here before the war, before 1939, were murdered either in the city or its vicinities, or were deported to Belgium's concentration camp. So we talk about city with different names. I already used Lviv, Lemberg, and Lviv, and we also talk about different returns to the city of we are right now. And as we speak about personal perspective, over the last 2 decades, literature on the war, occupation, and the Holocaust has produced many new venues, new perspectives, and it's a still growing field. special attention and a special place is taken by accounts, memoirs, and voices of survivors. And they are a tiny share of what represents millions of dead. And we do not have that many accounts and meetings with perpetrators because of what happened after the Second World War. And one of the main sources for basically, or very often, are post-war trials, and they are of different kind, happening in such places like Nuremberg, but also in many places in Eastern Europe and as a part of Soviet justice system. We can recall among most known works a work of Christopher Browning, The Ordinary Man, which brought the story of the Reserve Battalion into 101, into Eastern Europe, to see the perspective of the other side. And we have some memoirs, and there is a huge set of questions about how something like that could have been committed, how one can reckon with that, how people could do that, what are the legacies, and how we face it, and how we deal with that. So, and there are many other questions and many other comments. So today we have a special occasion to talk with two people, and as a kids they were in Lemberg and in Krakow. But it's very, it is also the story of their fathers as they were here. So let me now introduce each of our speakers and guests and with whom we will talk. Nikolas Frank, journalist and writer. It's a good question, can a journalist and writer be retired? From Germany. Nicklas worked with German journal Stern, and he's most known for opening a highly controversial discussion in Germany about facing Nazi crimes, but not in general, but on the scale and within a family. Nicklas Frank is the youngest son of Hans Frank, a German lawyer who worked with Nazi party from 20s, later a personal lawyer to Hitler, and between 1939 and 45, a governor-general of occupied Poland known as General Government. It was the territory where 4 death camps were located, including one which has a terrible and special meaning for Lviv, Belgium. This was the site of murder and attacks on Jews, but also on Poles, and a terrible reality and terrible past described as war and the Holocaust. Today we discussed that a bit already with historians, and Hans Frank was tried in Nuremberg, was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This was a new concept introduced, and he was hanged. Many decades later, in 1987, his son, Nicklas Frank, published a book, Der Vater eine Abrechnung, The Father, a Settlement of Accounts. This was not only a book, but also a series of publications in journal, Stern, which dealt with the story of Hans Frank, responsibility, dark legacies, and family, and relation across the father and generation. So this story was put into several TV projects in the 90s and 2000s and a theater play. And today, Nicklas Frank is with us in Lviv. Horst von Wechter comes from Austria, as well as his family. He's coming from Austria. He was born right before the war started and pursued different careers before settling in the castle Hagenberg. The article published by Filipp Sends in Financial Times was read before, and this is the castle where Horst von Wechter lives. And it's also a story of facing the deeds and of parents, of father, Otto von Wechter was high Nazi official coming from Austria, and his name is tightly and hopefully connected to the city where we are right now, in Lviv. Again, in this context, it's important to use different names in Lviv and in Lambert. As a lawyer trained in Vienna, he occupied several high positions in civilian administration of the Third Reich, and one of them was the head of civilian administration of Lambert as a part of Nazi occupation. He served also in Vienna after Anschluss and in Krakow. And before 1942 and 44, he was a governor of Galician district. It was during this period and this administration that almost all Jews were put into ghetto and killed. He was also directly engaged and lobbied very actively the formation of Waffen-SS units enrolled from Ukrainians, SS Volunteer Division Galician. And after the war, he died in 1949 from TB in Rome. So this is the story of past and of fathers and what was happened. And there was an interview for an article, as I mentioned, in Financial Times by Filippe Sends. There was a talk in London this year, and this is this visit to Lviv with documentary crew. Today, the crew, which is also brought by Filippe Sends, and this is for me to introduce our third guest. And I want to greet him and thank you again, because without you, Philippe, many things wouldn't happen and this meeting wouldn't take place. It's hard to describe you as a guest in Lviv. For several years, you've been involved with Lviv-related topics and themes, and I hope you will share some of this story as well. Just to introduce you, I will mention a few things. So, Filippe Sends is a lawyer and a barrister practicing in London and internationally, and as a professor he teaches international law at University College of London. He's also known as a writer. Among his books there is a Lawless World, published in 2006, and deals with the issue of violation of international law in invading Iraq by the US and the UK. One of his last projects, focusing on Lviv, is a story of lawyers, and more specifically 2 lawyers that shaped the field of international law globally. Raphael Lemkin, who invented the term genocide, and Hersch Lauterpacht, who shaped the concept of crimes against humanities and advanced human rights after the war. If Lemkin's legacy is known in Ukraine mainly in the context of the discussion about Holodomor and famine as a genocide, awareness about their contribution and connection to the city, and more generally about international law, if we speak about Hersch Lauterpacht, is very small. And Philippe is doing amazing work and bringing it back, and works with young lawyers from Lviv in making this happen. So this is a bit longer introduction, and I would like to start with a very simple question. What brings you to this place and to this city so dramatically changed in the war, and why are you here and what that means to you personally? So I would like to start with Nicklas, as I introduced.
He forced us to come. Now it's understandable. So you have to ask him.
No, Philippe, because what does it mean? You've been here today, the whole day. If you've been here before, it's a place of returns, and what this place of coming here means to you, even if Philippe is part of the story, we take him for a moment away.
The only one I was here before was doing an article about Lviv when I was with Stern magazine. But it's for me a special place because here in the aula, my father delivered a speech on the first anniversary when they got Galicia after we invaded the Soviet Union. And in this aula he spoke some of the most horrible sentences he ever said in the auditorium in public. So this was for me a special day because the first time I was myself, now 75 years old, it was the first time at this place. He was saying the following sentences. Party comrade Wechter, that's his father. I have to say, you did well. In a year's time you have forgotten what a filthy dump this was. Lemberg is once again a true and proud German city. I do not speak about the Jews that we still have here. We will deal with them, of course. By the way, I hardly saw any of them today. What has happened? I was told that this city used to swarm with thousands and thousands of these flat-footed Indians, but I could see none. You have not done anything nasty to them, have you? And the protocol remarks great hilarity in the auditorium. So this is unbelievable that somebody could say those sentences. So it was for me a special hour when I was in this aula.
I wanted to answer what would coming to Lviv means for you.
That is
The question.
I don't have to answer you. I have to answer you. Okay, so I was here already in 2006, and it was such a pleasure to come back to Philippe because I feel I see the whole complexity between Austria, Vienna, and Worms, Lemberg, Lviv, and for me this is something very admirable, and I feel it in the buildings, and of course I miss the Jews and the Poles here, which are missing, but still all the buildings are much stronger. I see Viennese influence, architecture, and I see all this. I see the city is quite an amazing thing that it still exists, and it is so much filled of life and young people, and everybody is and it's so calm, it's so peaceful. So you would never understand what happens in the same country. And I'm very happy to be here. And, of course, my interest is, as I'm a castle owner, in the buildings, not so much in what Philippe wants to talk about, but still I will answer all the questions. But I refused to read this paper in front of Philippe because I wouldn't spoil my tongue with these words. And I think he finally agreed and understood. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Philippe, it's what brought you to Lviv earlier and what brings you today? Your turn.
So thank you, Sophia, and thank you for the invitation. I got an invitation 5 years ago from the University of Lviv to give a lecture on the area that I work in. I'm a professor at the University in London. I teach international law, and I was asked to come to Lviv to give a lecture on my work in the fields of crimes against humanity and genocide, which I teach, but I also work on as a barrister. I'm involved in a lot of the cases that you will have known about in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, in Congo, in Libya, about these issues. That is not why I accepted the invitation. I accepted the invitation because my grandfather was born in Lemberg in 1904. He only lived here for 10 years. He left for Vienna in 1914 when the First World War broke out. And he then lived in Vienna for 25 years until he was chased out of Vienna because he was Jewish, and I'm Jewish. And he went to Paris, where he survived, and went with my mother and my grandmother. And so I was curious to know what this city was like. My grandfather never once talked to me about Lemberg. He lived until 1997, so I knew him for nearly 4 decades. But he refused to talk about what happened in Lemberg and in Vienna. And it's a common theme for a lot of people who went through those experiences. And I thought I'll come and have a look. And I've now come back and I've finished a book just about the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide, which were really invented in this city, unbelievably. But more to the point, I discovered about the life of my grandfather. And of course, what I did not know is that, and I share this with you now, I've never talked about this publicly before, what I discovered was that my grandfather came from a very large family of more than 70 people who came from Lemberg and a nearby town called Żółkiew. And of the 70 people, he was the 70 people who were alive in 1939. He was the only one to survive. And that was why he never talked about it, because it was simply too painful for him. And of course, the reality is, and I sit here and I express my deep gratitude to Nicklas and to Horst for coming and for befriending me. And I do think of them both now as my friends. We've come to know each other very, very well. And I'm strongly of the belief that responsibility does not pass down generation. And these are both my friends. But the reality and the interest in the story is that their fathers are responsible for the deaths, every single one, of my grandfather's family. And so it's a curious and complex relationship. And we have now engaged on a project of coming back to the city and telling the story, if you like, of how crimes against humanity and genocide began in the city and the role of their fathers, but in particular, and this is what interests me the most, how does a son deal with the legacy of his father? On the one hand, it is a usual custom in life that a son would have some honor for his father. But equally, one would expect, as is another sort of custom, that if one's father has killed 3 million people or 500,000 people, one should engage in a degree of recognition of responsibility for what one's father has done. And so it influences and informs the love or not that one has for one's father. And so for me, the central issue about coming back here and being in this city for the next 3 days together on a private visit with our friends from the film crew is understanding this relationship between responsibility and love, or absence of responsibility and absence of love. And how does one deal with such a legacy? I've lived through my family side of being, if you like, on the other side. But frankly, I think of Horst and Nicklas as much as being a victim as my mother was a victim. They live every day with the reality of their parents' role in what happened. And so for me, it's about exploring in a very open, frank, honest, and friendly way between ourselves how one deals with the reality. And at the heart of the story is this remarkable city. So that's why I'm
here. It's a set of complex relationships, but they are very profoundly human, because relations between parents and kids it's one of the most often quoted themes in culture, in literature, and in daily life. But also another topic which I would like to explore with you and learn in this way about you and let us learn a little bit about you, is it touches somehow artificial dichotomy between public and private, things which are discussed privately and faced privately in the moments when you can go with that publicly. It has a very special meaning for this specific city and also for Ukraine, and in a way that post-war decades were very much silence and oblivion, distortion, things which had no place in public, because public, one can argue, existed or didn't exist. That was official for sure. But many things were said or not said privately in family. And depending on location, this is a different combination. And not always you can answer this question by saying what is allowed in public and not allowed in private. Things can be silenced in both spheres. But still, we do talk about more than 4 or 5 decades. And I would like to ask each of you to tell how the story of war, but actually not really war, a story of your father and parents was a part of your growing up. And this growing up was happening in 2 different countries, in Germany and in Austria. And if you can also a little bit relate to the place where you've been living and how it's connected, or maybe not connected, just your personal reading. Who would? Nicklas goes first. If you could turn on the mic.
If you grow up in Germany after we lost the Second World War, it was always a big silence inside the families. This also was the reason that I wanted to break the silence, at least when I was nearly 50 years old. Because the German history did a very good job. I think that not a single German crime that not has been thoroughly researched and written down, and everybody can read it. But inside the families, the silence is still going on, and mostly, if it comes to a conversation, mostly German people are comparing our crimes with the crimes of the other people, and so to minimize them. The second thing is that most German people are saying it's so long ago, let's at least forget about it, and we paid so many millions to the state of Israel. Now we are really fed up to talk about it. It's gone. Let's live into the future. That was the second thing. And the third thing, which always makes me furious, is that, okay, my father was tried, but most of the not so big criminals could survive in a climate of let's forget about it, let's build up a new democracy, and let's enjoy life. And on the other hand, if you don't dry a swamp, the poison flowers will grow here and there, which you also can see in Germany. Still, we are a very good functioning democracy, but it was always, till nowadays, a good weather democracy. We haven't proved it that we are really Democrats, that we really are not able anymore to commit such horrible crimes which our fathers and grandfathers committed. And when I started to write this book, but also decades before. I always was very curious to hear from my relatives of my dead father, from the friends and the officials who also worked in Krakow and in Lemberg. They always told me lies, just lies. They always said they were not responsible for the crimes, they were just the civil administration, and especially my father was such a wonderful guy and he treated all of them very kindly. So they also admitted that there were some crimes against the Jews, against the Ukrainian people, against the Polish people, but it was always Himmler and his SS, but not the administration. And by the way, all the officials who worked 5 years in Poland and this part of Ukraine, those 5 years were counted to their pension, as if it was quite normal to invade a country, building up your own administration, and going back to Germany as if nothing has happened.
You finished? Okay. Yes, you wanted familiar situation, and I must say I can't remember. I can't say that I loved or hated my father like Nick, because I was too young and I don't remember anything about my father.
Same age, by the way.
Same age, and he remembers also when you were 3 or 2 years old. Everything what he's a very a genie in remembering things. Well, anyhow, I was raised by my mother, and she was really the person in my life which mostly influenced me. And she never talked about my father, but she would never talk something nasty or negative about my father. She said he was the most generous and the most lovable person she met, and that was really the man of her life, and she would never even regard somebody else, even if he would regard some other nice ladies, I think even in Lemberg. And so that is my family situation. My mother was, of course, she was an artist, one has to say, and she was of the Hofmannschule in Vienna. She attended, and she built in Krakow a really huge castle, which is still standing there. And in Lemberg it was too short for the time being here. But yes, and I must say that I don't have the same. My understanding of the situation is different, because I see this system working here, this crucial, very despisable system, and that my father tried everything to do something what he could do, what was in his power to do, and especially he was a friend with the Ukrainians, and he was in contact with. First thing he went when he arrived in Lemberg. I say always Lemberg. I hope you can understand. Is going to the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptitsky in his SS uniform, and Metropolitan was he said, well, there comes this SS general and he wants to put me into prison. But my father sat next to him and said, how can you help me that I can do something in the city which will be something positive? And that this establishment of this Waffen-SS division was his idea, because he said we have to recognize these people here. They are not under Untermenschen. They are not second-class people. They are the same like us, and they are not. They have to be accepted like they are. Because the official policy was, these people are second class. They can't fight, and they're completely uninteresting. Germany can do everything, and the German is worth much more than the Ukrainian. So he built this up, this division, but he also saved them to be transferred to Stalin, because Stalin was the first, the only division. But Stalin said, you have to. They fought against Russia, and they have to be put in the hands of the Soviet Union. And he had, with his contacts with the Church, with the Vatican, with the Bishop Butchko from Canada, he saved these people. They were flown out to England in 1947. Well, there are big things, and he loved the people really. When I remember somebody, after this article in the Financial Times, I got contact with Ukrainians living in Canada and in England, and of course here in Lviv. And they said, they were very positive and said, yes, my father was really, he had a character, and he tried everything what he could. And I just remember one scene when they went, this division was fighting against at Brody, and then they went to south, they fought in Slovakia, and at last they were in Styria in Austria, and he was coming there. He spent the last days of the Third Reich with these people, and then he met there. He was standing there and said to the Ukrainians, he said, "Look here, it's the same. It's so beautiful, like in Ukraine." And that is what somebody told me. These soldiers here, who were very well. That is all. I can tell you much more, but anyhow, I wanted to tell you. Yes, and then he saved. There was, when the Germans first went into Lemberg, there was from Himmler the idea of liberating whole Lemberg from everybody, from Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, to make it purely German city. And during this conference, when they were faced with other things, he stood up and said, "We cannot afford to get rid of all these people. We need them." And then this SS Krüger, who was the top SS, said, "You are not really. Your mind is not. You're not behaving like an SS Führer. You're something else." But so he saved practically through this intervention. By my understanding, he saved the whole city from another pogrom, which happened in Samosh. I don't know if you know this, near Lublin, where all the farmers were driven out, and they settled some Germans there. It was a whole chaos, and here the whole Lemberg remained. There were no underground attacks and no attempts and nothing. So it was really calm when he went. He was here. So that's another thing I want to tell. Yes, and of course I want everybody of you to abhor every racism and anti-Semitism, and which is the world now is filled up with all these things, And we have all watch art to intervene and do everything what we can to avoid these things happen once again.
I would like to have like 3 small comments and then opening it more to the audience and also to historians. So I would start with a word you mentioned in the answering first question. It was about built environment and Lviv, about the fact that the city is undestroyed. And it's true, it's a very unusual and very unique situation for Lviv that almost 90% of its built environment, the material fabric, survived the war. And the city was in post-war decades in different ways, and especially now is praised for that. And personally, for me, it has double meaning, and it's actually very ambivalent. Because if you look at the history of people, you appreciate the beauty, but you also see how this beauty hides and is like a veil, which makes a distance very often hard to penetrate. It's not the only, of course, reason, but it's also an obstacle. And another general comment is it's about word used. It's a system or regime, or maybe some of the historians would say totalitarianism, and that the system we are talking here, Third Reich, was a totalitarian, which on one hand describes part of reality, but on the other hand also we need to think about agency and choice and making choices and being aware of how much we live with individual who is a part of that and how much we put aside and say that this is general. And the third comment is about very concrete episode in the history of the city and history of this territory. It's about SS Galician, which is a contested topic in Ukraine right now. And the question is very hard for some this is a story of heroes, for some this is a story of perpetrators, of collaborators, and of people who were engaged in fight and crimes and were complicit in what happened with Jews and to a degree with Poles, but also later on. So this is a legacy which is very hard for Ukraine, and also we see how, in what way it unfolds. It unfolded in recent decades and unfolds even right now. But speaking about facing these legacies and quoting the book which is here, it's called Bringing the Dark Past to Light. I know that there are historians who are back there, and I would like to get some comments from you, because the last was bridging this territory to the story of Waffen-SS Galician, and then also to Ukrainian, to emigration and going to Canada. And it takes our story from Lviv to other places, and a whole different story, but also a part of this place. So we have John Paul Himka and Jan Grabowski. I would like to ask John Paul, especially because John Paul is an editor of this volume, which is called Bringing the Dark Past to Light, The Reception of the Holocaust in Post-Communist Europe. So if you could speak. I would like to speak on specifically on Waffen-SS and some comments which you have, which I can't not know. Okay.
A lot of the people from the division preventing and justice coming back. There's a Veterans Association. Their grandchildren certainly feel that their grandfathers were heroes. And I suppose much the same thing is true here. Very difficult to piece together the entire story of what they did during the war. And a lot of the records have been destroyed. So we know about the Battle of Brode, and then they went and fought in Slovakia, as Mr. Wechter has pointed out. But there they were suppressed the Slovak uprising. And so they were engaged in anti-partisan warfare, and they worked very closely with the other and units, which was pretty much a hard criminal unit. And in the suppression of the uprising, they're accused of destroying several Slovak. They're also accused, and probably rightly, of destroying Polish settlements in Lviv, Then they moved to Sofia, where they were also involved in anti-partisan warfare. German anti-partisan warfare was fairly violent. So their legacy is difficult to know, because as I say, the documents were destroyed. They were formed after the Holocaust.
Після Голокосту їх формували після того, як вже більшість євреїв загинуло. Тобто вони брали участь у полюванні на євреїв, на цим Ян, і вони не брали активну участь у масовому вбивстві поляків на Волині.
One thing, though, that is often neglected is that it took into its ranks many former policemen and many people who were in German punitive units. So that, in particular, they got officer functions because they already had some military experience. That's what I can say about that. And it's been very hard to research and very hard to get Ukrainians in Canada who are generally tend to think that these were very good people. And it's true, as Mr. Wechter said, history was in favor of this. And many other Ukrainians were regular vійська. So then the larger question that arises here, which is, well, what do you do when you have people who were good fathers, good grandfathers, good daughters, accused of very complicit in murder and mass murder. And it's a very difficult question. When we think of criminals in Canada, we usually try to think of the prison system. We don't even think very much about the punishment, but we think about their rehabilitation. But the fact of the matter is that most of these people who were actual war criminals and managed to settle in Canada or the United States then went on to live very productive lives. In normal circumstances, there were normal people who raised children, who contributed to the economy, contributed to the community, and very quickly became something different than they were during wartime conditions. But natural justice demands that they somebody punish for what they did. So it's a difficult moment. Because, first of all, I take a very Christian view of things. You have to make a distinction between the sin and the sinner. People can do wrong, but it doesn't exhaust what they are as people.
Люди роблять зло, люди роблять погане, але це не вичерпує їхнього значення як людей. Вони і інші речі робили. Певною мірою ми всі в чомусь винні, так, і всі ми в чомусь певною мірою добрі люди.
Very briefly, I would like to, my connection to the city is to an extent similar to the, and dissimilar to the experience that both gentlemen had. My own father spent 9 months in the ghetto before escaping for other parts of Poland. Now, I would like to thank Mr. Frank for his very honest and very moving short words, which I took with much gratitude, and I will now prepare the omission of not having read your book, and I will read it. As far as Mr. von Wechter is concerned, well, fathers are fathers, everyone is entitled to loving his father's memory, as physically you do. And it's no place for a historian, who I am, to lecture you, because information is readily available. And even if your father expressed a degree of sympathy for Ukrainians, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever in the life and then in the death of all people surrounding my father and his family. And the fact is, of course, you, and of course, he participated. And the proofs are so many that, of course, it would be now completely irrelevant and useless from my point of view to enumerate all the sources which are readily available. But as I mentioned, I understand that this is more about emotions than about history.
So I would like to, with these comments from historians, keep the space here to the audience, but before we do that, would you like to comment back, or maybe some thoughts, or...
Just briefly, you know, I wear two hats. I'm a university professor. Well, I suppose I wear three hats. I'm a human being like Professor Grabowski. There's an emotional reaction to these things, and we're participating now, trying to put the emotions to one side, but I also wear an academic hat. But the third hat that I wear is as a barrister. So I litigate cases, and I litigate brutal, terrible cases of mass murder. And I go to mass graves, and I sit in court, and I hear terrible stories. And one of the things that you're trained to do as a young lawyer is when you sit in court hearing the other side say things that agitate you, to never show it. To sit there poker-faced, expressing no indication to allow the judges or the other side to know that they've tweaked you. It's a way of not straying into emotion. And I have to say, and I say this with full friendship, having heard what Professor Grabowski has just said, it was very difficult for me, Horst, to sit here and keep a poker face, which I think I managed to do, like a good English lawyer. Because, like Professor Grabowski, you know, it's one thing to have evinced sympathy for Ukrainians, and I have a lot of Ukrainian friends, and I too am feeling very sympathetic towards many Ukrainians. But I noticed, or at least I couldn't help but not notice, that you didn't express any regret for what your father had done. You didn't mention that your father was indicted for mass murder, that he was wanted on an extradition request for the rest of his life, that he went into hiding. And I have to tell you, as someone who spent 25 years litigating cases of international crime and mass murder, that I have no doubt whatsoever that if he had found himself in court, he would have been convicted by a fair and independent group of judges for the commission of international crimes. And Professor Grabowski has mentioned, you know, there is a mass of evidence, which of course takes us into a different place. And one has to therefore ask the question, what is it? This fascinates me. I don't draw a moral difference between the two fathers. I think the two fathers are equally culpable. But they are equally fathers, and they are equally human beings, and I take Professor Himke's point. So the thing that is of interest to me is, how can two individuals who've gone through essentially identical experiences come out in such very different places 70 years on? And it's 7 decades, not just 4 or 5. And 7 decades on, these issues still resonate, and they get passed on down the generations. One of the things I admire very much about Horst is Horst and I have talked always very openly, and Horst has hidden nothing from me. Anything I have asked to see, Horst has made available to me, which I think is just truly remarkable and a mark of genuine engagement, much as I may disagree with aspects of interpretation. How has this happened? And one of the things that you didn't say, Horst, and I'd like to hear you say something more about it, in response to Sophia's question about family, is what about the next generations? What about your own children and how the legacy of what happened has been passed on? And why did you not share with this group, perhaps through lack of time, that with the next generation, your family, you have effectively been punished for speaking to me and for speaking openly? In other words, there's a desire to cloak the whole thing in silence. So what you're picking up from me is complex, because on the one hand, there's much that Horst says that troubles me very, very greatly. On the other hand, he has engaged very openly. And so I have a very complex relationship. I would say also in the spirit of equivalence, I understand the way Nicklas has gone, but equally, I have to say, there is an element of the position that he has adopted that troubles me, in the sense that at the end of the day, it was his father. And the apparent absolute absence of warmth, I'll put it like that, for the father at a very human level is something that is troubling. Perhaps I'm wrong to be troubled in that way, but those are my reactions to what I've heard. But I should say to the younger audience here, I've spent long enough now with Nicklas and Horst to know that anything you want to ask, you should ask it. There's no-go area. So if they don't want to answer, they won't answer. But please ask the questions you want to ask, because that's the spirit in which they have both engaged very wonderfully, and in which we are here today.
So let's go ahead. Try to ask any questions which might come.
They are all Ukrainians.
They are. I mean, they are from Ukraine. Yes.
They are all Ukrainians. No Jewish or Polish.
I mean, Jan Grabowski, Jan Rivier do have different, but
Oh, you can stay.
Tatiana.
Thank you. Okay, I have two questions to all of you. How could you break the silence, and was an easy decision for you and your family? What reason pick you up to do this difficult step? Thank you.
Yes, I can start. Okay. Well, of course, it was Philippe who gave me the last push. Because the thing is like that my relation, my family, they abhor what I say, and they tried everything to that I don't go into the public, and that they destroy documents and won't give up their very nice films of my father, and they refuse any cooperation. It's all silence, and I'm so furious about this thing. I think they're all cowards, and I won't accept this, and that's why I started in my old age to go along with Philippe and Nicklas and be able. I was saying that the last month I got all my documents from my mother, who wrote many things, letters from 800 letters also from Lemberg and things, to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And they digitalized everything, and I'm quite happy that I can speak to you and did this thing. I'm very grateful to you. So,
just if I can a little bit elaborate, this was a question of moment, but it's a question probably of time, of many, many moments, many, many steps. And as you said, Philippe was a push, but things were happening before. And what were these steps for you, but also for you to come at much earlier, like 3 or 4 decades? Was it a moment, which rarely is, or from what this moment of going public is made of?
I'd just add to that, just to explain the context, because you need to understand. I was writing a book about Lviv, Lemberg. I came across this guy, Hans Frank, so I started reading all the academic books I could, the articles that I could about Hans Frank, and I came across this book by the son, Nicklas Frank, and I thought this book is really interesting. It is an extraordinary book. You should read it. And I read it, and then I contacted him, and I wanted to really meet him. I really wanted to meet this man who'd written such a book. And we met in Hamburg, and we had an extraordinary first meeting, and then we met again. And then one day, Nicklas said to me, "But you know, Philippe, not everyone is like me. You must meet my friend Horst." And I said, "Okay." He said, "You're interested in Lemberg." His dad ran Lemberg. Go and meet Horst. And so I contacted Horst. Well, I think you made the first contact. And I'm thinking, why would Horst want to meet with me? He probably thinks he's going to be attacked by some crazy person whose family perished in these pits. But no, Horst opened the door, and we went to Schloss Hagenberg together for the first time. Extraordinary place that it was. And I think the question has to be asked, adding to Sofia, why on earth, at that moment in 2012, did you accept to have me in your house?
Because I accept everybody in my house. You're not excluded. That's the answer. You're all invited.
But as small details come, I want to ask you about one thing you said, that Nicklas said, "My friend Horst." So how 2 of you came to know each other, not on pages of books or in documents, but personally, how you know each other?
Yes, I remember. You came. It was you said, "Oh, I look up all the governor's sons," or something like that. I chased all those people, and that was the reason why you came twice before. Okay?
And to be friends with him is very easy. Now you know him. And I'm used from inside my family to become friends also with people whose thinking I can't stand. Because my 4 siblings, 3 of them defended our father as the innocent victim of Hitler, and the court of the victor. So I always used to fight with them, and we also, not to ruin our personal life, we decided at one point, okay, let's stop talking about our father and about politics out of this time. Stay friends because we are brothers and sisters. This was the reason. So that I'm used also to be a friend of him. Unbelievable guy who thinks in a way. He is, for me, the typical guy from Austria and Germany who wanted to minimize the crime. So you have him in living color. And you will find him 1,000,000 times in Germany. And I admit, it's still around the world a big taboo to accuse your parents. You have to love them, to honor them. But for me, it was, okay, I looked for a very long time to find something good what my father has done. Maybe at least he has saved 1 Jew or somebody who was human. But I couldn't find. So it was easy for me to decide. The first decision was very young. It was, I would say, subconscious don't let ruin your life, your personal life, through this parent. And when I was grown up, it was for sure. I didn't want to ruin my life. So, as I told you before, the first book came out when I was nearly 50 years old. I was a settled journalist, a very lazy one, by the way, but a good earning. Afterwards, in 2005, I published a book against my mother, and I used some pictures because his mother was a wonderful photographer. She had not only a camera, but also a photo apparat, and did a lot of pictures. Also photographing me when I was a very small boy, and my parents and my siblings, so it was really great. He wasn't very satisfied when he read the book, and he said, if I would have known what you are going to write, I don't think that I would have given you the pictures. But I got your permission. And what you mentioned before, I have one daughter. She's born in 1966. So she grew up with all the documents I brought home and telling her, Franziska is her name, look at this Franziska, how terrible your grandfather was. She was then about 13, 14 years old. So she's now complete on my side. You have to tell it, and this was also the reason for my book. You have to be very tough against your parents and grandparents. You really have to ask them tough questions. What I myself never did. But my mother died on my 20th birthday, and I was from my 11th year of age. I was in a boarding school about 1,000 kilometers away from Upper Bavaria in an isle of in the North Sea. So I couldn't ask her. But I'm a member of this generation who didn't dare to ask questions, because this big silence was really like a sword about your head. You knew immediately if you start asking questions, a very simple matter. What have you done during the Third Reich? What have you seen? Have you ever seen your neighbors who were by chance Jewish being forced on a truck, driven by rifles? And what have you known about Auschwitz, about Belzec and all the other camps? What did you know about Dachau? They would have been very silent, and at least they would have punished you, like doing your schoolwork or something like that. And I think my mistake was I thought my fellow journalists would immediately understand why I wrote this book. It's from the style of writing. It's from the first to the last page is a talk between my father and me. I always address him to you, and confronting him with all the documents I found and with all the memories I have been told from the relatives, from the friends, from the officials. But my fellow journalists were also sons and daughters of parents, and they said, this is not the way to deal with our past and not the way to love your parents, whatever they have done. And in 2005, I wrote this book against my mother, in the end. And this was another style, because my mother worked her life out. She died worn out in the age of 63, because after the war, all what we have stolen from the Jews in Poland and from the Polish people was taken away. Also our house and every asset, was nothing left. And my mother was a secretary by profession when she was young. but she never got a pension, and so she worked really hard. And I found a letter of hers in which she wrote to a friend of hers saying, "Now I must admit, in this time we were without any mercy. My father didn't do this."
Slowly our time will run to the end. I would ask you again to ask, comment, speak. Are you interested? Yeah.
Yes, first for Philippe, I'm sorry I didn't mention, because I'm deeply regret what happened. Of course I do. When I didn't mention, you said I didn't mention what happened. But the reason why I got so angry is this is typical Austrian character, because Austria changed for 5 times in the last century the attitude and character. And first they were monarchists, they were the empire, with the empire, then they became Austrians, then they became Nazis, and now they are Democrats, and nobody wants to mention what happened before. They all try to hide, and that's all covered by silence. If this happens in your own family, and if there's some interesting thing for the public and for history, then you have the duty to publish it, and that's what made me really angry. And that really I got angry with. That is what angst really. That is like a physical. They are afraid. Yes, my family, my relations, sons of my brother and my sister-in-law, and so on. And then I want to stress that about trials, that I just had the book where all this Jewish persecution is told by a German historian, and he really writes against my father, but in the end he lists the top officials of my father, 100 names, and he gives the details of their lives. And none of these 100 people were persecuted after the war in German courts or in international courts. They all lived until their 80s. There were many trials coming up, because it was starting, these trials were starting in the 50s, and also already after the war in the 40s, and going on until the 80s, these trials. And that is what I have to mention about the whole thing, about my father.
Because not a single judge has been sentenced to some prison after the war. Our top judges, immediately after the war, excused themselves, saying we only followed the then ruling laws. So nobody was accused. My last book in this life, I'm right now researching, it's about denazification. Every member of the Nazi party, it was about 6 million, 7 million, had to fill out many papers, about 600 questions. And most of them got something like a trial. And all of them, in the end, when it came to the Cold War, were innocent members. In German we call it Mitläufer, without any guilt. But they had supported in more or less important professions, and where they worked, always supported still to the end Hitler. And by the way, there's one remarkable book, Austrian Jew who immigrated to the United States in the 20s of the last century. He came back with the American army, and the first big town who was liberated by the Americans was Aachen. It was in autumn 44. And he was from a special intelligence branch. And he interviewed old people, young people, girls, men, public directors, every kind. And everybody was telling him, we know now German's future will be over because what we have done to the Jews, nobody will ever forgive us. After the 8th of May 1945, with the capitulation of Germany, it was all gone. Nobody wanted to answer the questions in this direction with, we knew what we have done. Everybody has forgotten.
I've got to mention this as an academic. There's an elephant in this room. And I'm wondering whether that is contributing to the silence. I'm surprised that there aren't more questions. You've got here an extraordinary opportunity to question two people who are sources of information that, as any person interested in this one would have thought you'd want. The elephant in the room, of course, is Ukrainian involvement in all of this. Because one of the things one has to be very honest about is that there were many very good Ukrainians, but there were also many, many very bad Ukrainians who were handmaidens to the Germans. And every single account that is given as to who did what in the worst camp, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, describes hundreds, thousands of Ukrainians. And I come to Lviv, a city that I have come to love. You know, I have my roots here, I feel very at home here, I feel very welcome here, I have many friends here. And I wander around this city, and it's a shell of a city. It's a city that was built by other people, by other cultures, by other communities, inhabited now by Ukrainians, and nowhere, really, does one see an engagement with what happened. It's as though history also, it's not just the Germans, not just the Austrians, not just the British, but also the Ukrainians. And so I'm very curious to know, what is your reaction? You're sitting around the table, listening to a German and an Austrian, but there will be people in this Jewish family deeply in what they did. You ask them, have you questioned what they did in the war? Have you engaged with these issues? If not, why not? Why is that not going on? And maybe you have stories. But it's very striking sitting here that there is, I'm picking up a very strong sense of discomfort. And the discomfort, let's call a spade, is that there are many people in this country and in this who are deeply, deeply in what happened. So let's talk about that.
Can I say one remark to your words?
I'm deliberately provoking, but I just think our sound man wants to get something sorted out. I'm deliberately provoking as an academic. That's my function. And I want a reaction. I want to know how you react to what you have heard and how you react to your own stories that Sofia has raised very correctly as a Ukrainian about what one does to inquire about, what exactly happened in these difficult circumstances. And one has to inquire it also as someone who has a Jewish grandfather who went to Paris and who worked for the equivalent in Paris of the Judenrat. And you have to ask yourself, what exactly did he do? Things that my family doesn't want to ask about, and which I'm now engaged in trying to find out about. So the bigger question that is being asked, essentially by Nicklas, I want to engage, and Horst, who wants to engage up to a point, and by me, who wants to engage, is what's the level of engagement around the room? Is this an embarrassed silence? Does this raise real difficulties for each of you in this room to know what your own family members did in this period? Or is the silence due to something else?
Yeah,
just a little comment. Yes, in English language has a beautiful idiom, try walking in my shoes. I think that we need to try to walk in German shoes or Austrian shoes, and German and Austrian need to try to walk in our shoes. I think so.
Speaking about this conversation, these questions, many asked and many unasked, many details. You know, what it makes you think of, because personally and professionally, so. What are your reaction? It would be good if you could share, just as you share in the discussion at the seminar. It's not the same, but it's still.
Well, I would say that the big problem for Ukrainians to comment on that is because most of our relatives. It's grand or grandparents, because we are much younger, and they were dead, they were killed. There was nobody who you can ask actually about all these events, and I don't know how it is for majority of people here, but I would say that it was the case, at least in my family. There are just pieces of memories, and of course people share something, of course they mention something, but what they mentioned was mostly like horror and terror, and saying, okay, they first come for Jews, then they would come for us, and like that small memories that are about fear and about like, you know, you kids don't appreciate what you have, we grew up in horrible conditions. Or some positive moments, which is from my family, for example, when my grandmother told that the SS soldier was trying to kill her, and she asked to heal her, and also my grandmother, because she told like the grandmother was 1 year old, so it was like the baby would starve, and then he saw a baby and told, okay, no. So there were different stories, some positive, some negative, but they didn't have any like continuation. But my personal opinion, and maybe it's a bit cynic here, is that comfort or discomfort, because I speak from my perspective, is not because of engagement or not engagement, at least because I don't have any examples of engagement. As I tell my parents, grandparents, all family were peasants, they have other experiences. I think that our, maybe at least mine, discomfort is this question, why do people do that? I mean, you as a lawyer have examples of current genocides, and that is a problem, and that is a discomfort, and that is a discomfort, I think, to some extent for us here, of what is going on in our country. I mean, we are now a country in a war to some extent, and it is very hard to deal with this. And again, you ask yourself the question, why do people do that? Why you can find a shocking video in internet of all the humiliation and I don't know, tortures and other stuff. And that is a question I would like to ask you, all three of you. What do you think? I mean, it's maybe a very naive question, but it's what I think touches the most. Why do people do that to other people?
Maybe let's try to collect some thoughts and associations you have out of this conversation. More of that, yes. Any type. What it makes you think of. This. So if you could stand up when you are talking.
Thank you. Stand up. What do you mean? Yes. I also do not know. I didn't know my grandfathers, neither one nor the second one. But the thing that I think of is also a question. I'm interested in the thing, what feeling do you have? What feeling is that comes out as a result of this knowledge of the truth? And does this feeling and publishing these things, does it give you the feeling of some release from the pain and sorrow? So, just one thought. Thank you.
I can think about, like, as people speak about their personal experience, but I have a feeling personally about urgency then to ask questions, especially that then you do not have somebody to ask this question as time goes. I have a story of my family coming from near Drohobych and Podhaici, and because my grandmother married very late and my mother married very late, I never met my grandparents, and they never knew that she married, and she got me. But there is a big chunk of my grandmother's life which none of us actually knows. She was a maid in Jewish house in Drohobych, and she spent there 15 to 18 years of her life on a daily basis, taking care of a kid and of house. After earning money, she decided that it's time to move on, and she bought a plot of land in another town. She married. She got 3 kids through the war. My mother was born in 1941, and basically the only glimpse, I actually have 2 glimpses which passed. One is in mid-30s. It's that she was reading with a boy. I have no idea what is his name or surname. There's nothing on that. A story of a British king who decided to marry and not to have a crown. And another is a story of the war, which was that they lived in Podhaici, already married, that she seen Jews forced into the ghetto, and that she felt very sorry, and her grandfather said, "You just get into the house." Basically, it's not really clear what is that, because there's no way to, they died in 70s. And so this is, apart from personal curiosity and the basically need to know the life of your grandparents, and then thinking that maybe it's how story played out with getting married and getting kids, is a story of engagement of Ukrainians in the Holocaust as accomplices, as witnesses. And it's also a story which is very hard to research of daily life, because there were much of interaction which have very little, not that much of coverage of these precisely mundane and daily things which escape with the record very often. The second part is a story about Polish-Ukrainian relations. And my second part of my father comes from the near Przemysl, which is now Poland, and I grew up with, on one hand, appreciation of Polish language and Polish literature, and on the other hand, my grandmother, she was very old also, I'm a late kid, saying, "You never marry a Pole." So this long-lasting animosity and this question of how many things you can ask and how many things have relevance in later generations, and how many things we can transfer. On the other hand, we are living here and right now, and we are making our own decisions of what we think is good and bad, what things are relevant and not, and what questions we can ask and we don't ask. The thing about, I also think that some questions we might ask later and there won't be anybody to answer these questions. And another thing that for difficult questions, there are no good times, because they are difficult. So you basically have to be brave and start asking them. And start asking them privately, and also even more importantly, publicly. And one of the, just to get over the private thing here is that on the territory of Ukraine, there are so many experiences of the war. And it's very hard to shape one narrative. You have a story of auxiliary police, and a very difficult to ask, which gradually get asked and will take us years and years to figure that out. Difficult questions about the way Red Army liberated Ukraine, another set of questions. Difficult questions about what was happening in the whole of Ukraine, because it's a story of victims, which is very largely shaped right now that Ukraine is a territory of victims, but also of those who did things, but also of how we treat heroes. And there is these millions of Red Army soldiers who were from Soviet Ukraine, and then some from Western Ukraine at the end of the war, part of the Red Army. So it's about having and finding a space and capacity, intellectual but also emotional, to have these different stories together without them actually fitting each other. So how to make the room for all of that, and how to, I don't know, you can't make sense of that, but you definitely can try to do that and try to know more and more and not hide. And therefore, I think that this meeting, from my personal, is about many elephants in the room, and also, difficulties in asking questions, but also about necessity of doing that. So this will be my tiny bit to that. And we are running out of time, but if somebody would like to share something or tell something, I think that this will be the topic which could probably come back, as we will spend 3 more weeks here. And Philippe won't see that. But still,
Well, I have something to say about it. Of course, for Nicklas, everybody in the SS and police who was in top engagement was sentenced either to life imprisonment. You can see that, but not, as I said, in the civil government. There was only one person who was Kreishauptmann in Prohobitz. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he was dismissed by my father. Secondly, I want to see the general situation, which is completely different in Poland and here in Ukraine. You can see it when you compare the Krakow and Lemberg. It's completely different. And Krakow has become a sort of tourism hell. And in comparison to Lemberg, you see everything is natural and is stayed natural, and that is, I think, that is the main point, which shows also the people are different, because Poland is a neighbor with Germany, and there was always this animosity during the centuries, instead of Ukraine, which was animosity between Poles and Ukrainians, and of course they were affiliated always to Germany, more or less. That is quite clear. But yes, that is what I can see, and I can just congratulate you for your city, how it's developing. And these people here, that they only found their nation after 1991. Yes, because they were persecuted first after the Austrians, by the Poles, and then by Germans, and then by Soviet Union. So there's a completely different timetable and different attitude to history. Now, I think that's a great moment for you to see everything, and of course, what Philippe said about it, there's no commemorative to us, and it's so purely Ukrainian now, the whole city. There's no written English. It's very difficult to find or commemorative what happened and where it happened and so. And well, that's the situation because of course the history is like this. You will have these big problems now, and I hope everything will conclude in peace. And see you. Okay.
I think we do have, thank you. We do have different readings of Lviv, and would you like to say?
I think just a number of questions were posed, and I think it's, since I won't be here for the next 3 weeks, and I know I'm sure the seeds that are sown by today will continue to be discussed. But you asked a huge question. Firstly, thank you for the two of you who got our questions discussion going. I've benefited hugely from hearing what your questions and comments are. Just very briefly on each. Why do people do this? I mean, that's the question. Why do people do this? And it remains to me today an absolute mystery as to how the events that happened back then could have happened. How deep the anger must have been. What is it? Is it about power? Is it about economic? Is it about religion? Is it about tribalism? Is it about, what is the reason that people are able to get themselves? But at the heart of that answer, the common theme that emerges in the cases that I do, in this story, but in relation to Libya, in relation to Rwanda, in relation to Yugoslavia, in relation to Congo, in relation to Syria today, in relation to Palestine and Israel, it is the capacity of human beings, one group, to treat another group as other, as though they don't share common elements of humanity. That is the first step to making it happen. And once that begins to happen, most people are willing to follow. Neither Otto von Wechter nor Hans Frank, in my view, were followers, they were leaders. They led the way. They showed other people how to do this. But the role that they played is picked up. They were not the last to do it. It gets picked up. Now, my own country has responsibility in relation to these kinds of things. In relation to Afghanistan, in relation to Iraq. No country, no community is exempt. But you've asked the really big question, and I think that relates, to the second question, which was how one feels about these things. Personally, I always love talking about things. I always feel better when I've talked about things. Even though I don't like a lot of the things that Horst says, I feel better hearing him say them, and I feel better engaging with it than just pretending, people like this don't exist and I don't want to engage with this kind of thing. So that's part of it. But the other side of it surely is the hope, the rational Renaissance type of hope, that we might actually learn something from hearing the stories of others and improve the human condition. That's essentially why we're all here in this room today. And finally, to the third person who spoke, the lady from Canada, thank you for your bravery and courage in speaking, because I think it's not easy to talk about this. We know it's really not easy to talk about this. It doesn't require an answer or a comment, but merely an expression of appreciation that you felt able to do that. I know that is a very big thing to have done. Thank you.
So I think that is a meeting which has time closure but doesn't have a closure in general sense. And because things are profound and the questions are big and the story behind it is terrible. But I thank you very much, Nicklas and Horst, for coming here. Thank you very much, Philippe, for what you are doing and for bringing and making. And thank you for coming and being. And thank you very much for listening, some for asking questions and for thinking for on about these issues. And for everybody who came today with us. So have a good evening and thank you.